The cross or crucifix is such a central figure in our churches, in our homes and in our faith. In this series, I'm going to be looking at 6 examples of the cross, of the crucifix, throughout the history of art, and seeing what they can tell us about our journey of faith as a church, about what the cross can say to us today, and about how these representations have changed over the years. Welcome to 6 Crosses. Hello and welcome to part 5 of our Lent series, looking at the cross in the history of Christian art. Last time we were in Spain, and I did promise that we were coming to Manchester for this week's cross. I'll come to that later on, but for starters, we're going to be in 19th century England. And I think to understand the image that we're going to be looking at today, it's just worth taking a moment to think about that Victorian age here in England. It was a remarkable century. Obviously, the Industrial Revolution had started at the end of the 18th century, and the new ways of manufacturing, the new ways of working were changing the world, and especially they were changing this country. And so in the 19th century, as that technology advanced, as we saw all those developments in industry, in manufacturing, in communications, in transport, in urban life, we saw a century of change, but also a century of revolution, a century of new ideas, a century of new things, perhaps things that we now take for granted, but which really turned things upside down in the 19th century. I was just thinking about a list of the things that you could point to in that. There were all sorts of political upheavals in the 19th century. We had things like the Peterloo Massacre in 1819 down the road in Manchester. Later on, we had Robert Peel, a Berry boy, who brought in all sorts of changes to working conditions, especially for children. There was a law he produced in the middle of the 19th century limiting working hours, respecting the rights of workers. And we see things like, up here in Rochdale, the work of the Rochdale Pioneers, the beginnings of the cooperative movement, a group of people who got together in order to make a difference to the lives of ordinary working folk. So the 19th century saw huge changes in the social situation in our country. There were huge changes for our faith as well. In the 19th century, we saw a sudden change in the attitude to Catholics. In 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed. For the first time for hundreds of years, there was an end to that persecution or discrimination against Catholics, banning them from many public roles. In 1850, we saw the restoration of our hierarchy. We got our own bishops and our own diocese. That's the date when the Diocese of Salford was formed, and we had our first bishop. And just before that, you had things like the Oxford movement, this movement of Anglicans who were seeking to rediscover their roots and returning to the Catholic Church, the most famous of whom was, of course, St. John Henry Newman. Well, even as all of these changes were happening in the 19th century, so too art was changing. Things had got, shall we say, a little bit stuck in their ways in the 18th century. Things had got a little bit, shall we say, dull. And so in the 19th century, we see lots of new types of art, lots of new expressions. The one that concerns us today is something called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Towards the first half of the 19th century, a group of artists down in London decided that they were going to step away from those norms, from the dull and grubby art that had become, as it were, the rule. They were going to break the rules. And they called themselves Pre-Raphaelites because they wanted to go back to a style of painting before the painter Raphael. Remember, we mentioned him very briefly, around about the year 1500. What they wanted to do was to go back to the Middle Ages. There were certain things that they wanted art to be. They wanted it to be more realistic. They wanted it to be brighter and more colourful. They wanted it to be more spiritual and more engaging. And they wanted, in a sense, art to say more to the viewer, to have a more profound and deeper message. There were certain famous names that were part of this thing. Ford Madox Brown was one of them, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, a man called John Everett Millais, and an artist called William Holman Hunt. And it's that last one is the one that we're going to be focusing on in our thoughts today. But these artists got together and started producing a new type of art, a type of art that was, in many ways, revolutionary. And it certainly shocked. The Victorian establishment wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Some people enthused about it, others utterly and completely detested it. And it's true to say that even to this day, Pre-Raphaelite art is a bit of a Marmite thing. You either love it or you hate it. But these Pre-Raphaelite artists went on to influence lots and lots of later artists, the works of things like William Morris or Edward Burne-Jones. These are names that you'll find popping up at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. And when we start looking at the art that they produced, it will feel quite comfortable to us. It will feel quite familiar to us. It doesn't have the shocking value that it perhaps had in the middle of the 19th century. But that's because we've been so used to this style of art taking over so many things. So, what are we looking at? We're looking at what some people call the masterpiece of Pre-Raphaelite art. It's a painting that was produced around about 1873 by the artist William Holman Hunt. Its title is The Shadow of Death. I'm not showing it you yet because if you've never seen it, it'll come as a wonderful surprise. But the idea was that Holman Hunt wanted to represent our Lord Jesus Christ as realistically as possible, but in a way that was, shall we say, down to earth. He'd been influenced by other artists, especially by a painting by John Everett Millais, which had been done about 20 years before, called Christ in the House of His Parents. This painting here. As you can see, it first of all looks very realistic. It's very skillfully painted, though sometimes you might think that the poses are a little bit unusual, perhaps a little bit forced. What this painting depicts is Jesus in Joseph's workshop. Since this is actually the feast of Saint Joseph, it's quite nice that we are in the carpenter's shop with him. And in this scene, you can see how Jesus is depicted as a youngster. He's the one front and centre with Mary, his mother. The scene is meant to be domestic, it's normal. This is not one of those glorious scenes like some of the crucifixions we've been looking at, some other religious art. This is completely domestic. That was what a lot of people criticised it for. What's actually happening in the picture? Well, we've got Joseph working on a door. And what's happened is that Jesus has actually cut his hand on a nail sticking up. You can see right in the middle of the picture a nail sticking up out of the door, which his grandmother, St. Anne, is working at to get rid of. Jesus takes his injury to Mary, who is literally kissing it better. But there's an element of something else going on in this picture. There's an undercurrent. There's another message if you look for it. You see how Jesus' hand, where the nail has cut, in a sense, almost prefigures the marks of the nails of crucifixion. And if you look closely at his foot, a little drop of blood has fallen on his foot, again, in the same place where the nails will pierce his feet. So those little tiny subtle things are these prefigurings pointing towards the moment of his passion. The other figures there, we have John the Baptist, who is on one side of the painting. Remember, John the Baptist was Jesus' relative. He's obviously staying over with Mary and Joseph, and he's bringing a bowl of water in order to bathe Jesus' wounds. Remember, John will become the Baptist in the River Jordan, using water to wash away people's sins. And on the other side of the painting, at the back, through the door, we see a flock of sheep and a very obvious ram staring at us. Remember the story of the sacrifice of Abraham and the ram that became the sacrificial offering? Remember the numbers of times in the scriptures where we talk about God as our shepherd, where we acknowledge Jesus as the good shepherd, and we are the sheep of his flock. Immediately below these sheep is another figure, an assistant in the workshop, who it's thought represents the apostles. So what we have is a simple snapshot of a domestic scene, but actually there's so much more going on. Now, this was a hallmark of the Pre-Raphaelites. You get what seems to be a snapshot of something ordinary, but there are so many other messages layered or hidden in the painting. Now, as I say, the Pre-Raphaelites provoked very extreme responses, and many people absolutely detested this painting of Millet, Christ in the house of his parents. One of them was Charles Dickens, who absolutely wrote the most scathing review. He detested this painting. One of the things he hated about it was how it seemed to depict the Holy Family in poverty, the Holy Family as a working family. And for some reason, he didn't like that. That offended his Christian Victorian values. That's interesting because that's relevant to our painting, which we're going to get to in just a second. When we do, you will see the influence of Millet's painting. The same idea was taken up by Holman Hunt. He was an interesting character. He started off as an agnostic, didn't really believe in anything, but then he had a conversion experience and he became a very committed Christian. And as part of his commitment to the Christian faith was a desire to try and present in art Jesus as realistically, as convincingly as possible. Now, he had painted many Christian-themed paintings. Most of them are in Manchester. I'll come back to that later on. There was a famous painting he did in the 1850s called The Scapegoat. The idea was that in the Jewish faith, a goat would have a red fillet braided around its horns and be sent out into the wilderness to represent the people of Israel, as it were, casting out their sins before God. Holman Hunt's painting is very striking and a very famous one. He also did another painting, which I'm sure you may well have seen, a painting called The Light of the World, representing Jesus standing at a door and knocking, referencing the scripture, I stand at the door and knocks, in the book of Revelations. Now, in this painting, Holman Hunt has not really got down to the nitty-gritty of that realism that we're going to see in a moment. Here, Jesus is arrayed as a rich and powerful priest king, wearing robes and jewels, looking majestic. Now that, in a sense, I think probably Dickens and his lot would have liked. So what happens when we get to the painting that we're going to look at? Holman Hunt had gone off to the Holy Land. He wanted to go there to breathe that atmosphere, to see exactly what it looked like, to find authentic representations for his art. And after many years, he produced what, as I say, many people think is not just his masterpiece, but a masterpiece of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So, big reveal. Here is today's painting of the Crucifixion, though it's a crucifixion without a cross. Here it is. It's called The Shadow of Death. Now, immediately you can see why it's in this series, even though this is actually a painting of Jesus in his foster father's workshop. This is Jesus working as a carpenter in Nazareth. In fact, the only two figures in the scene are Jesus and his mother Mary, who is that figure crouching down at the side. We'll come back to that later. The reason that we're looking at this as a depiction of the cross is obvious. As Jesus comes to the end of his workday, puts down his tools and lifts his arms, both perhaps to stretch after his labours or also to offer a prayer of thanksgiving to his Father, what we see in the evening light is that a shadow is cast. And that shadow falls on the wall behind him where it seems to rest against a cross. The tools lined up on the wall as that shadow hits them make the image of the crucifixion. And that's where the figure of Mary is so interesting, because she looks up from what she's doing and she sees this, the shadow of death. And you can almost see her body in the painting tensing as she sees what's going to happen to her son. Now, I think this is a remarkable painting. Many people don't like it. They think it's a bit gimmicky, it's a bit kitsch, it's a bit cheap, it's a bit sentimental. It's just a bit of a trick. And once you've seen that shadow against the work tools and you realise what's going on, there's nothing else in it. That's it. It's a very shallow painting. I completely disagree. I think there's a depth in this painting, which when you start to look at it, opens up all sorts of thoughts. I think there are two layers. The second layer is the really spiritual layer, which I'm going to come to later. But there is another layer, which was a distinctive feature of the Pre-Raphaelites, this idea of symbolism, the use in art of things that say something else. Now, in this painting, the first and most obvious one is that shadow against the tools. This idea that it's a painting of the Crucifixion many years before the Crucifixion without actually depicting the Crucifixion. That's the first obvious symbolic element. But then when you start to look, there's lots of other things. Notice at the feet of Jesus, he's taken off the woolen band that he's obviously been using to keep his hair out of the way while he's been working. But that band is red wool. It looks like blood. It's so bright it jumps out of the painting at us. Does it remind you of the crown of thorns? Because that's probably what it's meant to. Does it also make us think that something I mentioned a moment ago, that red fillet wrapped around the horns of the scapegoat carrying the sins of the people? So again, we start to see there's a lot more in terms of messages. Look at the painting, at the back of the painting itself, on the tools on the wall. Do you see hanging down from the rack of tools is a weight, a plumb bob, used by carpenters to make sure they get a straight line. Look at where that plumb bob actually sits on the shadow of Jesus. It's against his heart, the heart that was pierced with the lance. And if you look further down on the side, you will see the shadow of the saw that Jesus has been using. And that shadow seems to look like a lance being lifted up. There's so many other elements. We find on the side of the painting, there is a basket of reeds. Remember how a reed was used to lift up the sponge to Jesus as he was on the cross. There's other things. Look at the back on the shelf, on the windowsill. You see a scroll, the Hebrew scriptures, perhaps a prophecy, something from Isaiah, about who the Messiah would be. And also 2 pomegranates. Now, there are various interpretations of that. Some people say that the pomegranate is a symbol of the high priest, because apparently the high priest in Jerusalem would have pomegranates embroidered on his official ceremonial robes. Some people also say that the pomegranate was a medieval symbol of the passion, of the blood of Christ poured out on the cross. But very deliberately, we have 2 pomegranates positioned there. More and more, look above the window, and you'll see there is a star, the Star of Bethlehem, and come back at this point. And a beautiful little trick, one of those arched windows, Jesus is positioned so that that arch of the window actually forms a halo around his head, even though there is no halo painted. So you can see there's an awful lot going on in this painting. One of the most important parts is what Mary's doing. The artist is being very daring as he depicts her actually not looking at us. All we see is her back as she's rummaging in this chest. And what do we see in that chest? We see the gifts that the Magi, the wise men, brought to Jesus at the Epiphany. These have been stored away. These have been kept by Mary. Remember, the scriptures say that she treasured all these things in her heart. Well, she has kept those gifts. Perhaps she's looking for something else in the chest, or perhaps for some reason she wants to look back and remember those moments when her son was born. But that puts a wonderful dramatic moment into this picture, because at that moment, as she looks back at these gifts of his birth, she looks up to see the shadow of the cross. Does she then look back and see the myrrh that was a spice used for anointing the bodies of those who had died? And does she suddenly realize why that gift was brought to her all those years ago? See, there's so much that goes on in this painting. That's the artist's use of symbolism or typology, where things that seem to have an innocent position in a domestic scene actually have a much deeper significance, like that little wound and the drop of blood on the child Jesus in the Millet painting from 20 years previously. But Hunt takes this so much further, so much deeper. This painting was incredibly popular at the time. We were at a time, as I say, in the 19th century when new technologies were available, and it was possible for people to get prints of this painting. They sold in their thousands because so many people wanted a copy of this image. And eventually, the painting itself came to Manchester City Council, and then was given to the Manchester City Art Gallery, where it still hangs to this day. So you can go and see this one. And I've been talking about paintings in Italy and France and Spain that you might never go to see, but this one is down the road in Manchester. So we can all go when Manchester City Art Gallery opens up again, hopefully not too long, be able to go and actually see this painting for real. But the fact that it came to Manchester leads me to my other, as it were, spiritual thought about this. Do you remember I said about the Millet painting, that Dickens and others hated it because it showed the Holy Family as a normal family, as a working family, even perhaps as a poor family? So too, this painting by Hunt, The Shadow of Death, shows Jesus working. Now, it might surprise us, but to many Victorians, that was blasphemy. For them to think that Jesus had actually had to work, the sweat of his brow, the work of his hands, they just couldn't see that at all. And yet, that was one of the most important elements in this painting for Hunt. He actually wrote, "One of the problems of our age concerns the duty of the workman. Christ's life furnishes an example of the dignity of labour." Remember right at the beginning I was talking about those social movements of change in the 19th century. Things like the Rochdale Pioneers, the cooperative movement, the rights of workers. In many ways, Hunt's painting is putting Jesus on the side of the workers, because here he is, a young man who has given a hard day's work. He stretches at the end of that physical labour. This is not Hunt's earlier Jesus from the light of the world, dressed in the royal and the priestly robes. This is Jesus the worker, Jesus the ordinary man, Jesus the person who gets his hands dirty as we have to. And there, I think, there is the most profound message. Remember when I was talking about the Isenheim altarpiece, and I said it was all about God with us, about how Jesus was close to those who were suffering in that hospital? Well, in a sense, exactly the same thing is going on here in Holman Hunt's painting. This is Jesus the worker, Jesus with the workers, Jesus who knew what it was to be tired after a hard day's slog. Jesus is with us. Now, again, as I say, in the Victorian age, this was exactly what some people objected to, but it was also what attracted so many people to this painting, and perhaps especially the working men and women here in the north of England. Perhaps that's why Manchester was the right home for this work of art. Perhaps that's why this place where later we would see L.S. Lowry painting those remarkable images of those mill workers, this painting could speak directly to people who knew what a hard life was, who knew what it was to work, who knew how to live under the shadow of death. This was not a distant Jesus. This is not a Jesus on a throne. This is not a faraway Jesus. This is a Jesus who is so close to us, to our condition. This is the incarnate God, the God who truly takes our flesh. It's interesting, the painting references that, the Star of Bethlehem, the gifts of the Magi that Mary is looking at. This is the God who comes to share our humanity, the God who knows what it is to do a hard day's work. The world of work is still an issue today. We still hear people talking about minimum wages, fair wages, employment rights, unions. Jesus comes for everyone, and Jesus knew what it was to put in a hard day's work. When he goes to the cross, it is for everyone. Let's pray that his sacrifice may change our world and may help everyone to find that dignity of the labourer that this artist wanted this painting to speak of. Thanks very much for watching another episode. Do remember, you can go and see this painting. Manchester City Art Gallery has got a wonderful collection of Pre-Raphaelite paintings, not just Hunt, though you can see the Shadow of Death. You can also see the Scapegoat in Manchester City Galleries, and also the Light of the World, that's there as well. But there's a wonderful collection of other Pre-Raphaelite artists. There's lots of Rossettis there. And another place actually to visit, if you go down to Manchester on an art tour, make sure you go into Manchester Town Hall. Go into the Great Hall there, and on either side of that are 12 wonderful paintings by Ford Madox Brown, who was one of the founders, possibly the original inspiration for the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And there's a wonderful set of paintings of the history of Manchester there. It's free to get into, so once things are open again, have a trip down to Manchester and go and see the Manchester Art Gallery, look for this painting, and then nip round the corner to the Town Hall, have a look at the Ford Madox Browns as well. If you've never been in Manchester Town Hall, it's definitely worth a visit. Next week will be the last in this series, and we're going to come into the 20th century. Ooh, now that's scary because we're encountering modern art, something which is probably designed to turn off most people. But I've got a painting for us which is quite literally out of this world. Look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.